This is the guide to the Introduction to Philosophy paper. The reading for this paper is the Apology, but a section of it, and I'll speak more of that soon. The thesis of the paper is this. The purpose of this paper is to summarize and critically evaluate Socrates' horse trainer analogy and the unintentional argument. The overall issue is this. Do Socrates' two arguments refute the corruption charges against him? Now, in doing the paper, one of the things to keep in mind is that labeling the four sections is important. The reason why is it helps organize the paper, and second, and perhaps more importantly, it's how I grade the paper, because each section is worth a certain number of points, and when you label it, you're essentially saying to me, here is my introduction, here's my summary, here's my argument, here's my conclusion. And that way I know which points to assign. Now, in terms of the structure of the paper, as I noted, it's a four-part paper, and the first part is the introduction. The introduction is worth 5 points out of 100. So you'd want to, put your efforts in accordingly. It should be 125 words or less, and in terms of the content, it needs to contain these 5 things, each one worth 1 point. One is a clear statement of the thesis, which you can simply copy. That's fine. That would not be plagiarism. Second, a summary statement in which you essentially say that you'll be summarizing the Apology's key arguments. Second, your position statement on the issue, which would be that he does refute the charges against him, or he does not, or some combination of those. And in the argument section, I'll go over the various positions that you could take. The simplest ones would be, yes, he refutes them all, no, he refutes none of them, but then there are more complicated ones. Fourth is your argument statement, where you briefly tell the reader how you're going to argue. For example, you might say, in my argument section, I will show that by assessing the horse trainer analogy, using the standards of an analogy, that Socrates' argument fails. Or however you're going to argue. Lastly, the minimal background to set the stage. Something like Socrates is on trial, being accused of various crimes, and the Apology lays out the course of this trial. And again, it's worth 5 points, 125 words or less, and it needs to contain those 5 things. The next part of the paper is the summary. It is worth 45 points out of 100, and the objective is this. Obviously, to summarize the particular part of the text that's assigned. And this should be done clearly, concisely, accurately, and in your own words. And in terms of how it's graded, the paper guide contains a detailed guide to how exactly this is graded, but the overall grading, to avoid going into grinding through the rubric, is these things, namely, how clear is it, how concise is it, how accurate is it, and most importantly, how much is it in your own words. And you want to avoid quoting as much as possible, because the objective here is not to simply copy-paste from the Apology, it is to present to the reader a summary, which can be more difficult than it sounds. So what exactly are you supposed to summarize? Well, we now turn to the actual content of the summary, and it is as follows. In his trial, Socrates has 3 main accusers. There is Miletus, who represents the poets. There is Anytus, who represents the craftspeople and politicians. And there is Lycon, who represents the rhetoricians. Miletus is the main speaker. He does the talking. So what are the charges that Miletus levels against Socrates? Well, these charges, as I noted before, are not the sort of things you tend to see today. There's no accusation that he is a thief or an embezzler or engaged in, murder. So the first charge is that Socrates is a doer of evil who corrupts the youth. The second charge is that Socrates does not believe in the gods of the state, but has his own new divinities. Now, what about this corruption of the youth? So, according to Meletus, Socrates is a doer of evil and corrupts the youth. In his defense, Socrates tries to not only defend himself, but he's going to turn the tables on Meletus and try to prove that Meletus is a doer of evil, that Meletus pretends to be serious when he's only joking, and that Meletus is eager to bring men to trial from a pretended zeal and interest about matters he really has no interest in. So then he turns to engage Meletus in the classic Socratic questioning. So since Meletus says that he thinks so much about the youth, Socrates asks Meletus to tell the judges, who is it that improves the youth? Surely Meletus would know, since he took such effort, so many pains to discover the corrupter of the youth. Initially, Meletus is silent, saying nothing. And Socrates, to goad him a bit, claims that this proves that what he's saying is true, that he is, that Meletus really doesn't care. So forced to speak, Meletus claims that the judges, all of them, can instruct and improve the youth. When pushed by Socrates more, Meletus claims that the audience and the senators improve the youth. When Socrates pushes him again, Meletus goes so far as to claim that every single Athenian improves the youth, with one exception, Socrates. Socrates is the sole, the lone, the only corrupter. So how does Socrates respond back to this charge that he is the lone corrupter? Now Socrates has modified the charge. The initial charge against him is, of course, that he is a corrupter of the youth, and he is goaded and pushed Meletus into making the charge that Socrates is the sole, the only corrupter, and all other Athenians improve the youth. In response to this, Socrates presents the horse trainer analogy, and it goes like this. According to Socrates, one person is able to do the horses good, or at least not many people. Who is this person that does the horses good? Well, this would be the horse trainer, because the horse trainer has knowledge. Other people who lack knowledge, who have anything to do with horses, would tend to injure them, harm them. And he takes this to be true of horses and all other animals. Now this is where he makes the analogy, not like super explicitly laying it out formally, but here's the comparison. He claims the condition of the youth would be happy if they had one corrupter and everyone else improved them. And so his point here is that in the case of the horses, only one person with knowledge can do them good, and the one that can do this is the person with the knowledge. And in the case of the many, they would tend to harm the horses. And by analogy, Socrates infers that the same is true of the youth, that it is the few with knowledge that can help them, and the many who do not know can harm them. And so Socrates concludes from this that Meletus never had any thought about the youth, and that Meletus's carelessness, his sloppiness, is seen in not caring about the charges he brought against Socrates. Socrates then modifies the charges again. So he asks Meletus a series of questions, again kind of pushing him through the Socratic method, and Meletus agrees to the following claims. First, it is better to live among good citizens than bad citizens. Why? Well, the good do the neighbors good, and the bad do them evil. And Socrates gets Meletus to accept that no one wants to be injured, rather than benefited by those they live with, because no one likes to be injured. So then he asks Meletus, is his corruption, that is Socrates' corruption, intentional or unintentional? And Meletus says the corruption is intentional. And this modifies the charge for a second time. The original charge is that Socrates is a corrupter. And here he modifies the charge to not being a corrupter, but being an intentional corrupter. Now, he recounts what Meletus has said, that Meletus has admitted the good do the neighbors good, and the evil do them evil. And Socrates contends that since he knows that if he corrupts people he has to live with, it's very likely he'll be hurt by them. And so, given what he's argued that no one wants to be hurt, Socrates concludes that there's only two possibilities. Either he does not corrupt them, or if he does corrupt them, it is unintentionally. So either way, Socrates concludes Meletus is lying. Because if Socrates does not corrupt, then Meletus is lying. And if Socrates corrupts unintentionally, then Meletus is lying as well, because he's not corrupting intentionally. Now suppose that his offense is unintentional, that Socrates does corrupt, but does so unintentionally. And in response to this, Socrates says, the law doesn't punish people for unintentional offenses. So, if Meletus believed that Socrates was corrupting the youth unintentionally, he should have taken Socrates aside and privately warned him and corrected him. And if he had been better advised, Socrates says, he would have stopped whatever corruption he was doing, that he was allegedly doing unintentionally. Yet, as Socrates points out, Meletus had nothing to say to Socrates and refused to teach him. But now, Meletus drags him to court, which is a place of punishment, not instruction. And so Socrates concludes that Meletus has no care about the matter. He's just out to get Socrates. So once you've summarized the charges against Socrates and summarized the horse trainer analogy and the unintentional argument, that will conclude the summary. And then you would proceed to writing the argument section. The argument section is worth 45 points, and hence you should put your effort in accordingly. Now, the first thing to do once you've started the argument section is present your position. Now, the overall issue is, do his two arguments refute the charges against him? Now, since Socrates modifies the charges and he's got two main arguments against the corruption charge, there's actually multiple positions you can take. Now, this will seem way more complicated than it is, but here it goes. So, here are the 6 issues that arise. The first one is this. Does the horse trainer analogy succeed as an analogy? And the answer is yes or no. Secondly, does the horse trainer analogy refute the original charge? And the original charge is that Socrates is a corrupter. The modified charge is that Socrates is the only corrupter, the sole single corrupter. And so there's 3 issues going on here. Does the analogy work? Does it refute the original charge? And does it refute the modified charge? Now that seems like a lot, but you can answer this in a single sentence. You could say, for example, I believe the horse trainer analogy fails, therefore does not refute either charge. So even though there's 3 positions being taken there, it's done in a single sentence. Or you might say the horse trainer analogy succeeds, but it fails to refute the original charge, but it succeeds at refuting the modified charge. Now, with the unintentional argument, same sort of thing. Socrates modifies the charge, so there's the original charge and the modified charge. So you'll have 3 issues to address, taking 3 stances. The first one is, does the unintentional argument succeed as an argument? Yes or no. Does the unintentional argument refute the original charge, that Socrates is a corrupter? yes or no. And then last, does the unintentional argument refute the modified charge, which is that Socrates is an intentional corrupter? And again, even though it seems like there's a lot going on here, you can take care of this in a single sentence. For example, you might say, it is my view that the unintentional argument succeeds as an argument, but it fails to refute the original charge, yet refutes the modified charge. Or you might say, the unintentional argument fails as an argument because a key premise is false. It does not refute the original charge. It does not refute the modified charge. And so you'll begin the argument section essentially with these two sentences. One sentence gives your position on whether the horse train analogy succeeds or not as an analogy. Second, does it refute the original charge? Third, does it refute the modified charge? And the same for the unintentional argument. Again, it seems like there's a lot going on there, but you're just answering 6 questions, and you could do it in 3 sentences, or rather 2 sentences. Or if you want to really condense it, you could do it all in 1 sentence. Now, once your position statement is out of the way, your 1 or 2 sentences, the next thing to do is, of course, assess the horse trainer analogy. So how do you do this? Well, the horse trainer analogy is an argument from analogy. We saw this when we went over the argument basics, but let's go through it again, so that way you don't have to go back and look that up. So with an argument by analogy, in the kind of complicated form, laid out formally, you've got 3 premises and a conclusion, and they are as follows. You have 2 things being compared, x and y. And so the first thing you establish is that x has properties p, q, and r, which could be any properties you're concerned with. Secondly, you establish that the second thing, y, has properties p, q, and r, and they could be any properties. Premise 3, x has properties z as well. And then you conclude that because x and y are alike in these other ways, and x is z, y is z. Now put more informally, the idea is this. You have 2 things. They're alike in some ways. You're concerned about one quality that one of them has, so since it's got it, and the 2 things are alike in these ways, the thing you're concerned about has that property as well. So how do you tell when you've got a good one, or a bad one, or an ugly one? Well, there are 3 standards of assessment. And when building your argument, you'd want to explicitly state these standards and explicitly apply them. It would make a very focused paper and make sure that it's complete. So the first standard is the number of properties the 2 have in common. The more, the better. The less, the worse. The relevance of the shared properties to the quality you were concerned about. The more, the better. The less, the worse. And lastly, whether the 2 things have relevant dissimilarities that break the comparison. Smushed down to one standard, it's the more alike they are, the more relevant ways, the better. Now again, when organizing the paper, it's a good idea, perfectly fine to begin by saying the horse train analogy is an analogy in which you're comparing 2 things and concluding that because they're alike in certain ways, they're alike in this other way, and they're assessed in terms of 3 standards, which are number of properties they have in common, the relevance of the shared properties, and the relevant dissimilarities. And then go and assess the horse train analogy by each of the standards. And that makes for a well-organized paper, because here's the argument type. Here's the first standard, does it meet it or not? Second standard, does it meet it or not? Third standard, does it meet it or not? So what does the horse train analogy look like kind of more focused in terms of what's going on, what's the comparison, in more detail? Because Socrates runs through it pretty quickly. And so here's how it would go. So you got the horse, and that's the basis of the start of the comparison. And then, of course, what you have is Socrates saying, in the case of the horses, you have one person, the horse trainer, who benefits the horses. Hence the green arrow, benefiting the horse. Then in the case of the many, who are ignorant and unskilled, they are harming the horse. Perhaps not intentionally, but they are harmful to the horse. And so the setup, what we would call the first thing, or X, is this. That in the case of horses, it's benefited by the horse trainer, the few, the one who has knowledge, and it's harmed by the many who lack knowledge. So that's the first setup. The horse has the properties of being benefited by the one who has knowledge, the horse trainer, and harmed by the many who lack knowledge, the many. So then here comes the actual comparison. So the first thing is, of course, what are the horses standing in for? Well, the answer is, of course, the youth. So in this analogy, the youth are like the horses. So one question would be, when assessing it, are the youth and the horses alike in enough ways? Are they alike in relevant ways? And are they dissimilar in relevant ways? And then, of course, to complete the analogy, you've got to bring in the one who has knowledge, who would presumably benefit the youth, who's analogous to the horse trainer. And so the question there, when assessing the analogy, is the one who has knowledge analogous to the horse trainer? Do they have enough similarities? Are they relevant? And are there dissimilarities that break the comparison? And then to finish the analogy, you of course have the many. And in this case, the many supposedly, again, lack knowledge, and so they harm the youth. So in assessing this, the analogy is essentially the horse are like the youth. So the question is, are they enough alike in relevant ways to make the analogy strong? Is it a good comparison, comparing the horse and the youth? Is it a bad comparison? Are there relevant differences? And then, of course, you also have to include, is the horse trainer who benefits the horse, is that suitably analogous to the one who supposedly benefits the youth? And in the case, the more critical part, of course, is in the case of the many. Is the many who don't know what they're doing, who harm the horse, are they like the many who supposedly don't know what they're doing, they're ignorant, who harm the youth? Now, if you think Socrates succeeded, then what you do is try to show that this is a good analogy, that it's a strong analogy, that the horse and the youth are enough alike, the horse trainer and the one are enough alike, and the many are, like the many, and that the scenario, the analogy works. If you think that Socrates' argument is weak and bad, you would focus on trying to show the relevant dissimilarities. How are the horse and youth not alike in relevant ways? How would the case of training a horse be different from training the youth in relevant ways that would break or destroy the analogy? And again, when doing this, a good way to organize a paper is explicitly focus on those three standards and apply them to each part. The horse compared to the youth, the horse trainer to the one, the many to the many, the influence on the horse to the influence on the youth, and go through, in a well-organized point-by-point examination, applying those standards. And again, if you think Socrates has got a weak argument, you'd focus on the dissimilarities, how there are, enough of them, and they're relevant. If you think that his argument is a good one, a strong one, you'd focus on the relevant similarities, there being enough of them, and the similarities being relevant and good, and the dissimilarities being few and weak. So that's how to construct that argument. Now, once you've decided whether the argument, the horse trainer analogy, is strong or weak, because it's an inductive argument, good or bad, then you'd go to the second part of assessing the horse trainer analogy, which is this. Again, the first question is it a strong argument, given those standards? Then the next question is, does it refute the charge? Now, Socrates, of course, has got two versions of the charge. The first one is, the original charge is, Socrates corrupts the youth. And so you'd have to say, yes, it refutes it, or no, it does not. An easy way to do this is to say that it doesn't. And the reason why is because the horse trainer analogy is aimed at the modified charge, that he's the sole corrupter. And so, although he seems to clearly imply that he, Socrates, is the horse trainer, the one, he doesn't actually explicitly say that. So, the original charge is that Socrates is a corrupter, and the horse trainer analogy does leave it open that Socrates is one of the many who's corrupting the youth. Now, you could argue that Socrates does refute the original charge, in which case you try to argue that what Socrates claims clearly tries to imply, suggest, or show that he is the horse trainer in the analogy. The modified charge is that he's the sole corrupter. This is also easy to address. If you believe the analogy is strong, what you'd say is this. The analogy is a strong analogy. The conclusion of the analogy is, of course, that there is not just one corrupter, there are many, and therefore the horse trainer analogy refutes the modified charge. If, however, you argue that the analogy is weak, then this is also easy as well. You would say Socrates' horse trainer analogy is a weak argument. A weak argument cannot support its conclusion, therefore he does not show that he is not the sole corrupter. So when assessing the horse trainer analogy, again, the first thing is assessing the quality of the analogy. Is it strong or is it weak? Based on those three standards. Second thing to do is to answer the question, does it respond to the charges? And there are, two sub-issues there. Does he refute the original charge that he is a corrupter? And does he refute the charge that he is a sole corrupter? And that ends the horse trainer analogy part. The next part is the unintentional argument. Now, there's a lot going on in the unintentional argument. Now, one thing to make it more focused and somewhat easier to do is when assessing an argument, you can focus on a key premise, especially if the other premises in it are all very plausible, and even in philosophy, there's no need to battle tediously over things that seem to be pretty reasonably true. I mean, if you want to, you can. If you want to go through and assess every single premise of the unintentional argument, that, the bad do bad, the good do good, people don't want to be harmed, you can do that. But it is fair game in a philosophical dispute to say, look, we can all agree that bad people, by definition, are bad, so they do bad things. It's like saying, baseball players play baseball. It's what they do. You don't have to really argue for that. Likewise, people do good because they're good, just like people who, make ice cream sundaes. Make ice cream sundaes. It's what they do. You can also probably, safely accept that people generally don't want to be hurt. I mean, again, if you want to argue for each of those points, that would be fine. But those points seem to be so reasonable, you can simply say these all seem to be intuitively plausible. There's really no point in fighting over those. But the key part of the argument, upon which the argument stands or falls, to use an analogy, it's like, like if you ever played that game Jenga, where you've got like a key piece that holds the whole thing up, and you pull that out, the whole thing collapses. Or if you want a building analogy, when they destroy, buildings, one thing they do is they find the key supports, blow those up, the building collapses. So the unintentional argument, there is a key premise. If this premise is not true, the argument fails. If the key premise is true, then the argument, assuming the reasoning is good, would be a good argument. So that is the linchpin battle. So to really focus the paper, that's the thing to focus on for the premises. Again, if you want to, you can go over all the premises, but it is fair game in a short paper like this to say, okay, I'm not going to fight over or fight against or for that bad people do bad. So the key premise is this: if he, Socrates, corrupts a man he has to live with, it is very likely he'll be harmed by him. So if this premise holds true, then his argument seems probably reasonable. If it doesn't hold true, then it's not going to be that good. So how do you assess the argument? Well, a couple ways to do it are these. One is to use an argument by example, which takes us back to the argument basics. You can see it there. I won't load it in the video to make it even longer. And one way to do this is use historical examples for or against Socrates' position. So if you're agreeing with Socrates that if he corrupts people, he'll probably be hurt, you'd want to find historical examples of people who corrupted others and then their followers turned against them and harmed them. Now, the important thing to note here is it's not that people, in the case of Socrates, it's not that he's going out and attacking people and they'd attack him back. It's that he's corrupting them and making them worse. So he's influencing them in a way, and not like an open enemy. So an historical example of during World War II, the Germans invaded Poland. The Polish people fought back. This shows that corruption is responded to. People likely to be harmed. That wouldn't be relevant to Socrates' case. What you need is someone in a similar, analogous kind of position, where they're sort of a leader or an influencer. They influence people, and then if they corrupt them, those people harm them. Now, if you think that Socrates is wrong, you want to find historical examples that go the opposite, of people who corrupted their followers, and their followers, the people they influenced, didn't turn against them. Now, you can also use arguments by example that involve fictional cases, movies, stories, etc. Now, that would be more of what in the philosophy business we call an argument by intuition, or appeal to intuition. And the idea is to kind of get people to kind of think that it's plausible. And you'd use fictional examples. The obvious weak point of using fictional examples, though, is they are fictional. So things go as the writers want them to go. So referencing a fictional example does have that serious weakness because it's made up. Now, that said, they can still be useful to kind of motivate your readers' intuitions. So if you can think of a good movie example or a good book example where somebody corrupts the people they influence, and they come to a bad end because of their corruption of their followers, then that could help sort of motivate your reader. Now, you'd also want to include historical examples as well, because again, if it's just purely fictional, the reader kind of says, oh yeah, that makes a plausible story, but could that happen for real? And similarly, if you want to argue against Socrates, you could find fictional examples that tell against him, but again, those also have the obvious weak point of they're made up. And so it's a perfectly legitimate tactic when arguing to use fictional examples in this kind of scenario where you're trying to motivate the reader to say, yes, that seems like something that could happen. And then the historical examples which show that it did happen. Now, I intentionally set it up so you can argue either way. There's no definitive best answer here. A second way to argue, and these are suggestions, you can use these or ignore them as you will, is to assess that key premise using an argument by analogy. And one way to do this is to use a dog analogy rather than a horse analogy. To illustrate, you could use the dog trainer analogy. If you want to argue in favor of Socrates, you could create an analogy and say, well, imagine someone who has a dog, and they make the dog mean. They teach it to attack and make it savage. Well, it's likely to turn on them and attack them. So by analogy, if Socrates is like the bad dog trainer who makes the dog bad, that turns on him and attacks him, if he makes the youth bad, they're likely to turn on him and attack him. Now, as I said, I've set this up so you can argue plausibly for either side. That's why I picked it. I did not want to have an obvious, right position. So you can also use the dog analogy the other way. In this case, the argument would be that a dog trainer who trains their dog to be savage and vicious and attack others, but the dog is completely loyal to them and never harms them. And that would be an argument against Socrates, that he could be the bad dog trainer, but his bad dog is never a bad dog to him. Now, you can also, of course, assess the reasoning in the unintentional argument. The gist of it is, referencing back to the summary, that Socrates says, well, if he harms people around him, they'll hurt him. He doesn't want to be hurt, so he's not going to do that. And you'd want to assess that logic. Does that seem plausible? And so kind of the question there is, are people, if someone does corrupt someone and they're likely to harm them, is the person likely to be unable to avoid this? So in other words, is the reasoning good? And so in assessing it, essentially you want to focus on, those two main things. The essential thing is that key premise. Is that plausible? Why or why not? And you also want to assess the general reasoning. So you would say that it's a good argument, strong, because it's inductive, if the premises are plausible and the reasoning is good. You would say that it's a bad argument if the premises are implausible and the reasoning is bad. Now you can also, of course, say that the reasoning is plausible, but the content is bad. And so there's different possible combinations. So worst case would be bad logic, bad content. Best case would be plausible premises, good reasoning. But you can have different combinations. Bad logic, good content, bad logic. Whatever your position would be. Now once you finish assessing the unintentional argument, the next step is to assess whether it responds to the charges or not. Like the horse trainer analogy, Socrates gets Meletus to modify the charge. The original charge is that Socrates is a corrupter. The modified charge is that he's an intentional corrupter. So you need to answer both. So how do you do that? Well, just like with the horse trainer analogy, it all follows from your assessment of the unintentional argument itself. So, with the original charge, kind of the easiest approach is this. The original charge is that he's a corrupter. So, if the unintentional argument works perfectly, what it establishes is this. Either Socrates does not corrupt the youth, or he does so unintentionally. But that leaves it open that he's a corrupter. It could be an unintentional one. So even if the argument works perfectly, it does not refute the original charge. So that part's easy. The easiest thing to do is say no. The conclusion of that intentional argument is either he's a corrupter, not a corrupter, or an unintentional one, but it still leaves a possibility of being a corrupter, albeit unintentional. Now in the case of the modified charge, it all depends on your position on the unintentional argument itself. The conclusion of the unintentional argument is Socrates either did not corrupt, or if he did, he corrupted unintentionally. So if it does succeed, if the premises are plausible and the reasoning is good, then he does plausibly refute the charge that he's an intentional corrupter. So if you establish that the unintentional argument was a good argument, you would say, having shown that the unintentional argument is a good argument, this shows that Socrates refutes the modified charge, that he did not intentionally corrupt the youth, because either he didn't corrupt them or is unintentional. Now, if you hold that the argument failed, you would say, given the argument has failed, it cannot support its conclusion, therefore he did not refute the charge. Okay, so now that you've gone through, assessed the horse trainer analogy, given your positions on it's refuting the charge or not, you've critically assessed the unintentional argument, given your position on whether it refutes the charges or not, the final step is the conclusion. It's worth 5 points, 125 words or less, and in terms of the content, the easy way to do this is essentially copy-paste from the introduction and paste it into the conclusion. What you change, though, is from I will to I did. So, you'd still say what the thesis is. Instead of saying I will summarize, you would say I summarized. And you'd say my position is. And instead of saying I will argue, you would say I argued. And the final relevant remark would be a closing point to the paper. Whatever you want to say. Something like, although Socrates is dead, people are still forced to read the Apology. So that is the end of the guide to the paper. There's also, of course, the very detailed PDF guide, which lays out all the stuff in written detail. And so concludes the guide to the paper.